Okay, let's start. As I said, welcome to Promethean Action's weekly class series for August 17th, 2024. Tonight's class is The Fight for American Culture with Robert Ingraham. My name is Tony Papert. I'll be host. Bob described the class saying that that we're going to look at the fight for American culture, and American culture's freedom and independence to the British oligarchy, which accompanied our Revolutionary War, and the same fight today and its role in the struggle to make America great again. With that, I'll hand it over to Bob Ingraham, who is the author of numerous books on American history and allied subjects, which can be found on Amazon.
Okay. All right, I'll just get started. Hello, folks. Good to see you. Well, I can't see you, but good to be here with you all again. So we're going to talk about culture. But I think the first place to start is to properly define the word culture. Because when people think about it,
your sound is bad.
Hold on.
Maybe interference with your it cuts in and out. Do you have earphones you can use?
How is that?
It's good now. I think the problem is interference between the sound coming to you and from you.
No, it's my thing just keeps switching off here. Well,
it was good last time you spoke.
all right, how is that?
It's passable.
All
I'll
right.
tell you again if it gets bad.
Yeah, it's not interference, it's the computer connection, these USB ports. All right, so to get back to this, you know, when people think about culture, there's sort of two ways that people think about culture. One is what you could call high culture. And this is generally associated with the arts, with poetry, music, ballet, the theater, painting, sculpture, high culture. And then there is sort of what is generally considered popular culture, which is, you could call it the culture of the masses. I don't know. But, one way to think about this is Hollywood, television, YouTube and TikTok videos, rap music, and other kinds of music. But so you've got these different ideas about culture. But look, what I'm going to pose to you is that none of these things really define culture. They actually reflect an underlying culture, which has much deeper origins and much deeper meaning. And I've discussed this before, and I'll just mention it, and we'll get into it a little bit. But when people think about American culture, they tend to think about things like art and music and other quote unquote cultural things, without thinking about people like Thomas Edison or the Wright brothers or the great scientific minds and inventors and others who developed a productive culture in the United States. Now, what we're going to talk about tonight, as Tony said, is the fight for an American culture. And this is mostly going to focus around the period following the Revolutionary War in the United States. And I'm going to begin with three short quotations from Alexander Hamilton. The first two are from his report on the National Bank. And the first one goes, "The intrinsic wealth of a nation is to be measured not by the abundance of the precious metals contained in it, but by the quantity of the productions of its labor and industry. The tendency of the National Bank is to increase public and private credit. Industry is increased, commodities are multiplied, agriculture and manufactures flourish, and herein consists the true wealth and prosperity of the state." And the second quote is also from the report on the National Bank. "To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted." All right, the final quote from Hamilton comes from his report on manufactures in December of 1791, within which Hamilton proposes the establishment of what he calls a National Development Board. And this board will be instituted, quote, "to promote the introduction of useful discoveries, inventions, and improvements by proportional rewards, judiciously held out and applied, to encourage by premiums the exertions of individuals and of classes in relation to the several objects they are charged with promoting, and to afford such other aids to those objects as may be generally designated by law." So those are the three quotes from Hamilton. But the just to repeat the one short section of the second quote, where he identifies as the objective of his entire economic policy, and particularly the establishment of the National Bank, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind. To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind. And what I pose to you tonight is that these three quotations, and particularly that little section I read, again, really supply the definition of what American culture actually is, what the culture of our new republic was actually grounded in, what it was based on. Now, people know very little about the culture of the late 18th century, and it's really unfortunate, because what emerged out of the American Revolution was an entirely new type of culture, absolutely alien to the oligarchical cultures of Europe. It had never been seen before, and it was grounded in the creative power of human beings, free from oligarchical rule. This was America, the beacon of hope, the temple of liberty for all of mankind, where human beings could begin to live free lives, where their human potentials their creative potentials, their ability to contribute to the advancement of society would not only be unfettered, but would be encouraged, would be welcome. And what we see in that period is the beginnings of an effort to create, essentially a new literary culture in the United States. And it really begins even during the Revolutionary War, although because the war was a war and overshadowed everything else, it really takes on momentum towards the conclusion of the war. Now, I'm going to go through a lot of this, and this is what's going to take up a bulk of my presentation. And a lot of these are going to be names that people have never heard of before, but I'll try to make it as clear as I can. The first person I want to mention is a man named John Trumbull. This is not the painter. There's a painter named John Trumbull. This is a different John Trumbull. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. He fought in a number of battles. And he actually began writing a poem, a 1,500-line poem titled McFingal. And he began writing it even before the war, in 1775, before Lexington and Concord. But he continued to work on it on and off throughout the war. It was finally published in 1782, 1 year after the Battle of Yorktown. It's a satirical poem in which he essentially makes fun of and holds up for scorn this character named McFingal, who is Scottish and who is an ardent loyalist to the British throne. Trumbull just sort of ridicules him from many different angles, exposes the absurdity of his views, it's very humorous. It's very funny. I'm not going to read any of it here tonight, but this was one of the earliest of these sort of what you might call patriotic poems, which were published during this time. Now, 3 years later, in 1785, and this is published 2 years after the Treaty of Paris and 2 years before the Philadelphia Convention, which established the U.S. Constitution. So it's in a critical period. A very lengthy poem entitled "The Conquest of Canaan" was published. It's actually has 11 volumes, so it's really long. It was written by a man named Timothy Dwight, and it's sometimes referred to as the first epic poem written in America. Now, again, I'm not going to read you any of the poem. It's sort of a funny poem in that I won't go into it, but it uses the biblical conquest of Canaan by the Israelites sort of as a metaphor for the Washington's victory in the Revolutionary War. And it has a dedication, and I will read you the dedication. Dedication to His Excellency George Washington, Esquire, Commander-in-Chief of the American armies, the savior of his country, the supporter of freedom, and the benefactor of mankind. This poem is inscribed with the highest respect for his character, the most ardent wishes for his happiness, and the most grateful sense of the blessings secured by his generous efforts to the United States of North America. By his most humble and most obedient servant, Timothy Dwight, March 1st, 1785. Now, both Trumbull and Dwight, um, as you know, as in the post-war era, were instrumental in the early 1780s in organizing a group of largely poets, not exclusively, but largely poets, who came together, who met, who discussed, who exchanged a lot of letters, but they met in person fairly often. A group of people in Connecticut who became known at the time as the Hartford Wits, or they were sometimes called the Connecticut Wits. And this included John Trumbull, Timothy Dwight, also a man named David Humphreys, Joel Barlow, Lemuel Hopkins, Elihu Hubbard Smith, and quite a few others. And again, these may not be names that you've ever heard of before, but they were almost all of them veterans of the Revolutionary War. Like, for instance, Humphreys was a colonel in the Revolutionary War. And after Alexander Hamilton resigned as the aide de camp to George Washington because Hamilton wanted a command post where he wanted a fighting command, which he finally got at Yorktown. After Hamilton resigned as the aide de camp to George Washington, Humphreys became Washington's new aide de camp. And he actually became a very, very close friend of Washington's. He also, in 1782, served as the intelligence agent for Benjamin Franklin in Paris during the Paris peace negotiations. So these were the kind of people that these guys were. And, in 1787, four of them, Trumbull, Barlow, Hopkins, and Humphreys, published again a poem. They're mostly writing poetry, a very, very long satirical poem titled "The Anarchiad." I think that's how you pronounce it. The Anarchiad, or American Antiquities, a poem on the restoration of chaos and substantial night. Quite a title. But this poem is a very biting satire criticizing the Articles of Confederation and calling for the establishment of a strong central government. It appeared it was serialized, and it appeared in 12 parts. And the first part appeared in October of 1786, 1 month after the Annapolis Convention, where Hamilton had authored his call for a constitutional convention. And they continued to serialize the poem right through the entirety, the spring and summer of 1787, all the way through the Constitutional Convention. And the last part of the poem appears in September of 1787, just as the Constitutional Convention is concluding. So this is essentially part of the organizing for what became the Constitution of the United States in the form of satire and poetry. And it is a satirical polemic against anarchy, against chaos, against mob democracy. And later on in 1791, some of these same Connecticut wits published another series of poems called The Echo, which was an attack on those in the United States who were fanatically worshiping the French Revolution. And this series of poems called The Echo, holds these people up to absolute ridicule. Now, I'm going to mention a number of other people. The Connecticut Wits is part of this. Most of them were extremely loyal to George Washington, although the group began to fissure and fracture later as certain British operations were launched, cultural operations against the United States. But the next person I want to mention is a man named Royal Tyler. Now, he's truly an extraordinary person, and I really hope that people will be encouraged. Everything he wrote is in the public domain, and it's available on the internet if you look hard enough. And I really encourage people to read some of his works because he is a very good writer, and he's very, very funny. And in 1787, Royal Tyler, who was also a Revolutionary War veteran, published a play which was staged at the John Theater in New York City, John Street Theater in New York City. It was a play called The Contrast. Now, this was the first play written by an American with an American setting, staged in an American theater in history. The first American play written by an American to be staged in an American theater. Everything prior to that had been imported from primarily England and elsewhere in Europe. This play is hilarious. It's called The Contrast, and it is a contrast between sort of what you would call what used to be called a fop, a dandy, one of these sort of aristocratic types in New York City who is a slave to British fashion and British manners. He's one of the characters. And then the other major character is a lieutenant in Washington's army. I think he's a lieutenant. He might be a captain. Who is of a completely different demeanor and a completely different outlook on life. So it's this contrast between an American patriot and this British worshiping pseudo aristocrat, and it is extremely funny. I'll read you a couple of short quotations out of the prologue to this play. It says a prologue written by a young gentleman of New York. And it's a long prologue. I'm just going to read you two short paragraphs. It goes, "Exult, each patriot heart. This night is shown a peace which we may fairly call our own, where the proud titles of my lord, your grace, to humble Mr. and plain Sir give place. Our author pictures not from foreign climes the fashions or the follies of the times, but has confined the subject of his work to the gay scenes, the circles of New York." Now, towards the end of the prologue, he says the following: "Be roused, my friends, his bold example view. Let your own bards be proud to copy you. Should rigid critics reprobate our play, at least the patriotic heart will say, glorious our fall, since in a noble cause his bold attempt alone demands applause." So this was an American play for Americans, starring where the lead character is an officer in Washington's army. Tyler wrote a number of things, and I'm not going to say a lot about Tyler because of time, but I'm going to mention two other things that he wrote. In 1797, he wrote a novel called The Algerine Captive. And it's the story of an American physician who is traveling around, and he ends up getting kidnapped by the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean, and then ends up spending 7 years in slavery in North Africa. And this is the story of his captivity and his slavery. It's very funny. And, although I've never found any proof of it, I thought this had to have been somewhat influenced by Benjamin Franklin's last fable, which he wrote shortly before he died in 1790. His fable on Sidi Mehemet Ibrahim of the Divan of Algiers, which again is about slavery and the Barbary pirates. And that was written 7 years earlier. But it's a polemic, very funny polemic for freedom, condemning slavery of all forms, proclaiming the nobility of the human character of America, of what America represents in the world. But it's all done in a very humorous way. And I'll just read you, I'm not going to read you anything from the story, but I'm going to read you one short quote from the preface to The Algerine Captive, and then a very short quote from the ending section. And in the preface, he says, "Since novels present a picture of the times, and since most of them are British, the New England reader is insensibly taught to admire the levity and often the vices of the parent country. While the fancy is enchanted, the heart is corrupted. If the English novel does not inculcate vice, it at least impresses on the young mind, American presumably, an erroneous idea of the world. It paints the manners, customs, and habits of a strange country, excites a fondness for false splendor, and renders the homespun habits of his own country disgusting." So that's from the preface. And then towards the end, he sort of, in the concluding section of the novel, he says, "My ardent wish is that my fellow citizens may profit by my misfortunes. If they peruse these pages with attention, they will perceive the necessity of uniting our federal strength to enforce a due respect among other nations. By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall." Then a few years after The Algerine Captive, Royal Tyler writes another piece called The Yankee in London, which is, I was discussing with Tony earlier, very funny. Again, all of this is very humorous, very well written. But this is a work, The Yankee in London, which consists of 13 letters that an American who is residing in London writes back to a friend of his in Boston. Now, these aren't real letters. This is a fiction. It's fictional, but they're presented as letters that he's writing back. In one of the later letters, after having lived in London for some time, he writes to his friend, "Let us, my friend, endeavor to guard against the delusions of forms and look to the essence of that national liberty for which our fathers successfully fought. I felt the dignity of my nature, that is from living in London. I felt the dignity of my nature violated. I felt more. I remembered I was of English descent, and I blushed for the land of my ancestors. So, you know, well, I'll just mention one other thing, and then I'll make a point. So you have all of these people, and then out of this sort of mix, because you're starting with in 1782, 1783, 1787. In the early 1790s, a group of these people came together. And this is sort of like a second generation. It includes some of the same people, but also people who were a little bit younger. They sort of coalesce in New York City, and they create something which became known as the Friendly Club. And this included the key leader there was a man named Elihu Hubbard Smith, who had also been a young member of the Hartford Wits. But it also it came to include William Dunlap, who was a playwright and a painter, Brockton Brown, who was a novelist, and others, William Woolsey and James Kent, and quite a few other people. If you look at the entirety of all of this, beginning with Trumbull, beginning with Royal Tyler, beginning with the Connecticut Wits, beginning and then going to the Friendly Club. What you see is an intention, a determination to create a new American literary culture, a culture grounded in the principles of the American Revolution, a non-oligarchical culture, a culture based on free human beings. This is literally this is what they're striving to do. One of the first things that came out of the Friendly Club was that in 1793, Elihu Hubbard Smith published the first ever collection, the first ever anthology of American authored poetry. And he published this. It was called American Poems Selected and Original. And you can get this on the internet. And it's there's a lot of poems written by quite a few people, a large number of people. And I'm going to read you I'm not going to read you any of the poems because these guys tended to write long poems. But I'm going to read you a couple of very short extracts, which is really not the right thing to do with poetry, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to read you a couple of very short extracts from a couple of these poems. One is from John Trumbull, who I already mentioned, titled Elegy on the Times. And in the poem, there is a section which is sort of titled, Where Tyrant Vengeance Waved Her Magic Wand. And he's describing the activities of the British during the Revolutionary War. And he says, Are these thy deeds, O Britain? This thy praise that points the growing luster of thy name? These glorious works that in thy latter days gild the bright period of thine early fame? Shall thy strong fleets with awful sails unfurled on freedom's shrines the unhallowed vengeance bend, and leave forlorn the desolated world, crushed every foe and ruined every friend? So that's a section from Elegy of the Times, his indictment of the nature and the activities of the British Empire. And then in a poem by David Humphreys, who I also mentioned earlier, it's a poem on the elegy of the burning of Fairfield by British troops, which again was an incident during the Revolutionary War. And again, this is just a short excerpt. It goes as follows. Long, dusky wreaths of smoke, reluctant driven in blackening volumes o'er the landscape bend. Here the broad splendor blazes high to heaven. There umbered streams in purple pomp ascend. In fiery eddies round the tottering walls, emitting sparks, the lighter fragments fly. With frightful crash, the burning mansion falls. The works of years in glowing embers lie. So again, and thematically, very similar to Trumbull's poem. He also, Eliot Smith includes another of Humphrey's poems entitled Mount Vernon, which is an ode commemorating one of Humphrey's long visits with George Washington in Mount Vernon. This was American Poems, Selected and Original, 1793. Now, Smith, Eliot Hubbard Smith himself is a very interesting character. And to give you a sense of how his mind worked, I'm going to read you two short things from him. He's sort of the leader of the Friendly Club. He didn't write a lot that was ever published. He wrote a few things. But he wrote a poem called The Discovery of Printing. And I'm not going to read you the poem. Again, it's long. But I'll read you the opening 4 lines of the poem, which go as follows. For unknown ages, mid his wild abode, speechless and rude, the human savage trode. By slow degrees, expressive sounds acquired, and simple thoughts in words uncouth attired. And what he does in the course of this poem is he traces out, in his own way, the development of human civilization, through speech, through other discoveries. And it culminates in the discovery of printing, because what he proclaims in the poem is that this was truly a miraculous invention, because prior to the discovery of printing, there was no way for profound ideas. There was no way to stimulate the creativity, the curiosity, the thinking of the general mass of the human species to these ideas, because people simply did not have access to them. And that with printing, this opened the gates for the widespread, widespread promulgation of human knowledge, of human ideas, of human discovery, of dialogue between human minds in a way which had never existed before. When I read the poem, one of the things that reminded me of, it's much different, was this sort of funny poem that Benjamin Franklin had written in 1744, entitled Ode to His Newly Discovered Fireplace, in which he writes a poem in honor of the Franklin stove, and how this had, was like a new sun, because it had opened up new productive opportunities for mankind. So, this is the way that they're thinking in terms of what an American culture represents in the world, in human history. Now, Smith himself, I'll get into it in a little bit, but this thing begins to fissure and fracture a little bit under British psychological warfare. And Smith himself, was somewhat influenced by these Enlightenment ideas and Enlightenment writers. And he also was very much opposed to the Puritan and Congregationalist religious leadership in New England, who were very conservative and who had a lot of power and political power as well as religious power. And Smith found himself on the opposing side of many of these ministers, and he came under strenuous attack, labeling him as an atheist, a godless atheist. And I want to read something to you because he wrote a letter to Timothy Dwight, one of the members of the Connecticut Wits, defending himself against charges of atheism. And it's a letter on the perfectibility of man. And I want to read to you what he wrote, just so you get a sense of the mind of this guy, of what he's really thinking and what's motivating him. And in the letter, he writes, "Man is an animal formed with certain capacities. These are not unlimited, for then he would cease to be man. But they are improvable, and that in two ways. First, by culture, and secondly, by an hereditary propagation to a certain degree of that culture. When we read the history of man, we must be sensible that he has undergone a gradual refinement of manners and acquired gradually an amazing fund of ideas and consequent powers, which he had not at first. We have every reason, therefore, which our knowledge of his capacities and his history can offer, for believing that he will continue to improve, or in other words, that he is likely to approach still more toward perfection. This capacity for progressive advancement toward excellence is denominated perfectibility, which, if you will observe, neither implies that man will ever become perfect, nor that he is not vicious and weak and imperfect now. Those who admit that man is a perfectible animal mean that he is an animal susceptible of all the improvement consistent with human nature." So this is the letter he writes to Timothy Dwight. Now, there are many other people associated with this friendly club, some of whom play a very important role. But I'm going to, I'm going to have to pick and choose what I do here, because there is just far too much to cover in this period of time. So, for instance, there is the playwright William Dunlap, who was the leading playwright in the United States, American playwright, for more than 2 decades, 2 to 3 decades. Who was a part of this friendly club in New York City. There is also the novelist Charles Brockden Brown, who is generally considered to be the first American novelist. I don't know if he wrote the first novel, but he made a career of writing novels, and he wrote quite a few of them. And he is well worth discussing. But I'm going to just mention them and not go into them, because what I want to get to here is the British counterattack against all of this. Now, look, what occurred with the French Revolution in 1789, and particularly in the first stage of the French Revolution, 1789, 1790, the early part of 1791, for say the first year and a half, is that many, many people in the United States welcomed the French Revolution. Some of them, were overjoyed with enthusiasm. And I'll just read you two quotes from two people who later turned against the French Revolution. The first is from Timothy Dwight, one of the, Hartford Wits, and he gave a speech in 1790 to the Society of Cincinnati, this group of Revolutionary War veterans, in which he says, quote, "The fire of freedom caught from this continent flames with godlike ardor in other parts of the world. In France, more than 20 millions of people have been rescued from the sufferings of ignominy and slavery and elevated to the dignity and happiness of freedom." So that's what Dwight says in 1790. And during the same period, the president of Yale, Ezra Stiles, wrote a letter to one of the leading supporters of the French Revolution in England, Richard Price. He wrote a letter to Price to quote, saying that it is time to congratulate the world on the glorious phenomenon of civil and religious liberty in France. Now, both of these people later turned against the French Revolution, but this is what they're writing in 1790, 1791. But then you had the turn towards violence and terror, culminating with the execution of Louis XVI, the execution of Marie Antoinette, and then the Reign of Terror, in which hundreds and hundreds of people were led to the guillotine, and thousands of people were executed, murdered in a bloodbath. Now, all of these events were intertwined with what was going on in the United States at that point, because what you had was Jefferson, who became this cheerleader for the French Revolution. I mean, remember, he was the ambassador to France during the early stages of the French Revolution, and he, was, meeting with a lot of the people who carried out the revolution. And he was back in the United States, Secretary of State, rapidly supporting the French Revolution, and basically building his own political faction, modeled on, the clubs and the societies of the French revolutionaries, including the Jacobin clubs. And he was organizing these clubs and this faction to directly attack Washington and Hamilton. And in particular, he was leading an insurrection against the foreign policies of the Washington administration and the economic policies of Hamilton. Because remember, Jefferson was violently opposed to Hamilton's National Bank, to the report on manufacturers, and what Hamilton was doing economically. And this all culminated in the United States in the Whiskey Rebellion, which broke out around 1791, 1792. But it really, the high point of the Whiskey Rebellion came in 1794. And this is when George Washington led a militia army, into Pennsylvania to subdue the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion was not some group of, organized, backwoods farmers or something. This was organized by Jefferson's Democratic Societies. This was an armed insurrection of thousands of armed soldiers against the Washington administration, organized through Jefferson's Democratic Societies. So this is the environment in which is taking place. Now, in the midst of all of this, you have in London an operation which is launched aimed at confusing, disorienting, and splitting the American public, destroying the unity of purpose and the unity of principle which had existed coming out of the Revolutionary War. The key opening salvo in this was the publication in 1790 by the British statesman Edmund Burke of a work called Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now, Edmund Burke is a real British oligarch. He wrote on philosophy, on economics, on statecraft, on a lot of things. Today, he is idolized by what you could call the old, old conservative wing of the Republican Party, not the Trump wing, the old conservative wing of the Republican Party. Hillsdale College loves Edmund Burke, but he wrote the Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790. And it is in this work that he comes out violently attacking the French Revolution. But what he says explicitly in the Reflections on the Revolution in France is he says, we are now at a historic moment where there are two pathways, there are two choices, in which humanity can go. On the one hand, we have, and he sort of defines this as says, there are two revolutions which are governed, and he says this, I'm not making this up. He says there are two revolutions which are governed by diametrically different principles. And we have to choose between these two revolutions and the principles behind these two revolutions. Now, don't forget, he's writing this 7 years after the Treaty of Paris. He's writing this 2 years after the adoption of the US Constitution, right? But the two revolutions that he says you have to choose from, neither of these is the American Revolution. The American Revolution and the principles which govern the American Revolution are not mentioned. Instead, he says, on the one hand, there is the French Revolution of 1789, which is, anarchy, atheism, mob democracy, godlessness, mass murder. And on the other is the glorious revolution of 1688, which brought William and Mary to the throne of England, which is associated with John Locke, with Isaac Newton, with the creation of the Bank of England, and the transformation of England into the modern day British financial empire, right? And what he says is you have the democratic revolution of 1688 versus the French Revolution. And this is what he puts forward. And this then is attacked by a number of people, including Mary Wollstonecraft, including Tom Paine, including a guy named James McIntosh, who denounces Burke's work as the manifesto of the counter-revolution. And this then is, becomes brought into the United States. And this is the choice you're supposed to make. You're either for the French Revolution or you're for the policies and principles of the British Empire. It's one or the other. There's no middle ground. You have to choose. Now, Burke himself was associated with a group of people in London who generally were referred to as the Club. And these included Samuel Johnson, Adam Smith, Edward Gibbon, Oliver Goldsmith, who wrote The Vicar of Wakefield, Horace Walpole, who was one of the originators of Gothic fiction. This was the oligarchical empire faction among the British elite. And opposed to them, were Tom Paine, a guy named William Godwin, who was probably the most important guy, his wife, Mary Wollstonecraft, Richard Price, and a whole bunch of these people who all came out of the Enlightenment ideas. They were steeped in Rousseau. Most of them were atheists. Most of them supported radical democracy. A lot of them had earlier been associated with Lord Shelburne and his Bowood Circle. And these were the two choices, that Burke gave you. Then what came next was that in 1797, John Robison published his Proofs of a Conspiracy. Robison is another one of these British, he's Scottish, another one of these British-Scottish sort of pseudo-aristocrats, in which he brings, he puts forward his whole theory of the Illuminati, that the entirety of the French Revolution was godless, atheism promulgated through branches of Freemasonry, and this is the primary enemy of all of humanity. And this is then brought into the United States. And you have this huge Illuminati scare in 1797, 1798, which a lot of people fell for. John Adams, but he was not the only one. And so, all of this is designed, to bury, the revolutionary culture, which was being created, which was being nursed, by people like Dunlap and Brockton Brown and Royal Tyler and the poets and Trumbull and others, to bury this and to confuse and disorient people. Now, I don't want to go on and on and on, but I just will mention before I conclude is that, after 1790, between 1790 and let's just arbitrarily pick a date like 1850. I mean, you could pick any date really. What you see in the United States is that, among, literate people, readers, and remember, America is a very highly literate population compared with Europe, that America is flooded, literally flooded with British literature, everywhere. This is true in the realms of philosophy, it's true in many different branches, but it's also true in terms of popular literature. And a key element of this was what became known as the British Romantic School. And this included people like William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Sir Walter Scott, who wrote Ivanhoe and Rob Roy. And all of this is this romantic literature, which glorifies really oligarchical values, which which nothing is left from the ideas that the American writers from the 1780s and 90s were trying to bring into literature. It also includes translations from some of the German Romantic writers. And this floods America. One of the things that happens is that American authored drama literally disappears. You still have people in fiction who are fighting this, like James Fenimore Cooper and Edgar Allan Poe, and they're fighting it, and they're, that's another story, not for tonight. But they're in the minority. Edgar Allan Poe is in the minority. The literature in the United States is controlled by this Anglophile crowd who are bringing this stuff in. And like in drama, American authored drama disappears, after the 1820s, 1830s, particularly after the 1830s. It literally disappears. That doesn't mean no one was writing plays. I'm sure there were, but there were no major playwrights, American playwrights who were being staged in major theaters around the United States in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Instead, what you get is minstrel shows. And in terms of plays that are being staged, it is unbelievable, the percentage of them which are imported from London. Like, for instance, just as one example, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. As some people may know, the play that Lincoln went to see at Ford's Theater that night was a play entitled Our American Cousin, written by an Englishman named Tom Tyler and originally staged in London. And then when it was a success in London, it was brought into the United States. And it's a play that portrays Americans as crude and backwards. And this was sort of typical of what we see. Now, look, I'm reading out a lot, and there's a lot more that can be said about this. I don't know if I've adequately portrayed the skill and the courage of what these writers were doing in the 1780s and 90s. But for time's sake, I'm going to have to sort of cut it short. And what I want to do, just in conclusion, is I want you to put up that graph, Tony, and hopefully people will be able to read it. Yes, you can read it. Now, I don't know if you can see it at the top, but the title of the graph is Human Progress in Culture. You could call it American Progress in Culture. But as you can see, it's divided into two sections. And the first is what was going on in terms of the development of the nation. As Hamilton lays out in those quotes that I read to you at the beginning of this class, the development of the nation. And secondly, what is going on in terms of the cultural initiatives which are being undertaken. So I'm going to just read this, and then we'll open it up for discussion. 1787, the first steamboat. The steamboat was developed almost simultaneously by a man named James Rumsey and another man named John Fitch. Rumsey was actually, I think, about a month or two earlier, but they discovered it at the same times. 1787. Fitch's steamboat was actually demonstrated on the Delaware River to delegates at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Washington and Franklin both helped finance the development of these steamboats personally. 1791, Hamilton's National Bank is established. 1792, the Cape Henry Lighthouse is built. This is the first public works project by the new American government, the first publicly financed infrastructure project. And it was built personally by Hamilton. And all of the lighthouses that were built were under the control of Hamilton's Treasury Department. 1800, Gouverneur Morris submits the first detailed plans, the blueprints for building the Erie Canal to the New York State government. 1802, West Point is established, and West Point will become not only a military academy, but the leading school of engineering in the United States. 1806, the construction of the Erie Canal begins. 1807, Robert Fulton's steamboat service begins operation. So this is not the demonstration of a steamboat. This is actually the regular operation of steamboats for commercial activity. 1815, the first operating railroad is built by John Stevens in Hoboken. And again, George Washington is long dead by 1815, but John Stevens had been an associate and protege of George Washington earlier. And then in 1824, the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute is founded by Stephen Van Rensselaer, who was a very close, a supporter of Washington, very close to John Jay. And the Rensselaer Polytech Institute rapidly becomes the leading scientific educational institute in the United States. So this is the unleashing of the productive development of the United States. Then on the bottom half, in 1782, you have John Trumbull's McFingal. I already mentioned a number of these. 1785, Timothy Dwight's The Conquest of Canaan. 1787, the Connecticut Wits publish the Anarchiad. 1787, Royal Tyler's The Contrast, the first American play staged in America. 1788, the Federalist Papers. 1793, L.U. Hubbard Smith's publication of American Poems Selected and Original. 1797, Royal Tyler's The Algerine Captive. 1798, Charles Brockden Brown's most famous novel, I think it's Violent or Wieland, or The Transformation, an American Tale, is published. He then published a number of more novels after that. 1798, William Dunlap's play, Andre, is staged. This is followed 45 years later by his play, The Glory of Columbia, Her Yeomanry, a very patriotic play. And then in 1828, his A Trip to Niagara. And The Trip to Niagara is kind of funny because there's a cameo appearance in the play by Natty Bumppo, Hawkeye, from James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales. He makes a cameo appearance in The Trip to Niagara. And then it's 1821, you have James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy, A Tale of the Neutral Ground, followed in 1823 by The Pioneers, which is the first of the Leatherstocking Tales. So this is what you have going on in America, this development of simultaneously of a productive economy, an inventive economy, a revolutionary economy, with a productive and revolutionary culture grounded in freedom, human inventiveness, human intuitiveness, opportunity, free of oligarchism. And this is what is emerging out of the Revolutionary War, which the British then declare war on in the 1790s. So with that, it's an incomplete story, but with that, it's an introduction. And with that, I will end my presentation for tonight.
Terrific, very inspiring. So, thinking of the things, I had to read in school, and, it's in poetry, it was, British or it was Americans who were self-exile to Britain.
Yeah.
The
Well, the whole transcendental movement. I mean, I don't want to, characterize it in a nutshell, but let's just put it this way: the transcendental movement, Emerson in particular, but many others, they were heavily influenced by this British Romanticism, heavily influenced by it. So it's not really American literature, I mean, people tend to portray it as some sort of, I don't know, an American version or American manifestation of some sort of Neoplatonism or something. It's not at all. It really is a derivative of what was being published in London at that time. So anyway, go ahead, Tony.